You've probably been told your whole life that empathy is the bridge to connection. That if you can just understand someone deeply enough, if you can hold enough space, soften enough, and prove you see their pain, they'll eventually open and meet you there. And in most healthy relationships, that's true. Empathy can be the medicine. It can melt walls, heal wounds, and create intimacy. But when you're dealing with an avoidant partner, empathy doesn't land the way you think it will. In fact, it often does the opposite. Because what happens when you pour all your empathy into someone who's terrified of closeness? They don't feel safer. They feel trapped. They don't think, wow, she really gets me. They think, this is too much, too close, too exposing. And the harder you try to show them compassion, the further they retreat. This is where so many strong, intelligent women get caught in the loop. You sense their distance, so you reach for understanding. You say, I know it's hard for you, or I get why you pull away. I just want you to feel safe with me. And instead of this being a balm, it becomes another reason for them to disconnect. Because your empathy in their world isn't safety, it's pressure. It shines a light on their wound. And avoidants don't want their wound seen. They want it hidden, protected, buried under self-sufficiency and distance. That's the cruel paradox, the very thing that makes you extraordinary. Your empathy, your emotional depth, your ability to hold another person in their humanity becomes useless, even dangerous, when directed at someone who fears being truly known. What you experience as love, they experience as exposure. What you offer as understanding, they interpret as invasion. And this is why you feel like you're going crazy, because your instincts aren't wrong. Empathy should build intimacy. But in this particular dynamic, it doesn't, not because you're doing it wrong, not because you're too much, but because empathy only works on a nervous system that's willing to receive it. So the real question isn't, how can I be more understanding? The real question is, why am I giving empathy to someone who cannot let it in? The first illusion we need to unravel is the idea that your love, your empathy, your consistency can fix the avoidance fear of intimacy. That if you just hold on long enough, if you just prove that you're different from everyone else, they'll finally exhale and come closer. This belief is intoxicating because it's rooted in your deepest strength. You know you have the capacity to love deeply. You know you can hold complexity, weather storms, stay when others leave. And in a healthy relationship, those qualities are gold. They make you the kind of partner people dream of finding. But in the land of avoidance, that gold is treated like poison. Imagine standing in front of someone holding a gift, wrapped with care, with every piece of your heart inside of it. And instead of receiving it with gratitude, they step back. They look at it with suspicion. They act like you're trying to sell them something dangerous. That's what it's like when you give empathy to an avoidant. Your love doesn't soothe their fear, it activates it. You see, avoidants aren't fighting against you. They're fighting against intimacy itself. They've built their identity around the belief that closeness equals suffocation, that dependence equals weakness, that needing someone equals danger. So when you show up with unconditional love, they don't register it as safety. They register it as a threat to their autonomy, and no amount of loving harder can override that survival code. This is why so many women in these dynamics feel like they're walking through emotional quicksand. The more you try to rescue him, the deeper you sink. The more you empathize with his trauma, the more invisible your own needs become. It's a trap because you start believing your love is the cure, when really your love is being used against you. Think about the quiet ways this shows up. You explain away his coldness because you know his childhood was hard. You rationalize his silence because you've read about attachment wounds. You keep forgiving the distance because you see the little boy inside of him who never felt safe. And on the surface, it feels noble. but underneath it's dangerous because you're empathizing with his pain while abandoning your own. And here's the hardest truth. No one's love can fix someone else's fear of intimacy. Not yours, not anyone's. An avoidant doesn't change because you hold more space. They change only if they decide to confront their fear, to do the work, to actually step into vulnerability. Until then, your empathy doesn't free them. It just fuels the cycle. So instead of asking, how can I love him better? The real question becomes, why am I pouring my love into a container with no bottom? Because every drop you give disappears into a void, and you deserve to give your love to someone who can not only receive it, but hold it with reverence. Here's the piece that takes your breath away when you finally see it. Avoidants don't interpret your empathy the way you intend it. What feels like tenderness to you feels like pressure to them. What you offer as compassion, they experience as control. And that single misunderstanding can twist an entire relationship into knots. Think of a moment when you sat across from him trying to reach him. Maybe he'd gone quiet again, withdrawn into his shell, leaving you desperate for connection. You leaned in, you softened, you said, I know this is hard for you. I get that opening up feels scary. I just want you to feel safe. You thought you were giving him relief, showing him you understood his inner world. But what he felt on the inside wasn't safety. It was spotlight, exposure, like you had just announced to him in the universe, I see your wound. And for someone who survives by hiding, that is unbearable. This is why avoidants so often respond to empathy with more distance. They interpret your gentle recognition as an attempt to manage them, to guide them somewhere they don't want to go. In their nervous system, empathy doesn't translate as freedom. It translates as a rope tightening around their neck. Have you ever noticed how they sometimes seem angry after you've been kind? How they bristle when you try to reassure them? That's not because you've said the wrong words. It's because your very act of naming their fear makes them feel stripped of control. And control is their oxygen. Here's the irony. Empathy is supposed to be the antidote to disconnection. But in this dynamic, empathy gets weaponized against you. They twist it into proof that you're trying to change them, manipulate them, or drag them deeper into intimacy. It doesn't matter how pure your intentions are. Their interpretation becomes the reality you're forced to live in. And slowly you start to shrink yourself. You start editing your empathy, tiptoeing around their sensitivities, second-guessing every attempt to connect, because you don't want to trigger their withdrawal. And in that shrinking, you betray yourself. You silence your natural warmth, your intuitive care, in order to preserve the fragile thread of connection. But let's be clear. Their misinterpretation is not your burden to carry. Your empathy is not control. Your compassion is not manipulation. That's simply how it lands inside of someone whose nervous system equates closeness with danger. And once you see that, something powerful happens. You stop begging them to see your heart clearly. And you start asking yourself, why am I fighting so hard to prove that my love isn't a cage? Because here's the truth. The right person won't confuse your empathy with control. The right person will see it for what it is, a rare and beautiful gift. They will meet it, cherish it, and return it. And once you understand that, you'll stop twisting yourself into knots trying to prove that your love isn't pressure. You'll realize the problem was never your empathy. It was where you kept trying to give it. If this is landing for you, subscribe. We're just getting started. One of the most painful realizations is that your empathy, as generous and unconditional as it is, often trains the avoidant to believe they can disappear, and you will still be there when they come back. Without meaning to, your understanding becomes the safety net that enables their escape. Think about the rhythm you've probably lived through. They pull away, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. And what do? You remind yourself of their wounds. You whisper, he's scared, it's not personal. You wait, you forgive. You soften your heart so that when he circles back, you're there to welcome him, open arms, no questions asked. On the surface, it feels compassionate, but underneath, it creates a dangerous pattern. He learns that withdrawal works, that silence has no cost, that vanishing is safe because you'll absorb the pain and he won't have to face it. This is the unspoken contract empathy creates in these dynamics. You carry the weight of both hearts. You feel the sting of abandonment, but also make excuses for it. You experience the coldness, but cushion it with logic. He doesn't mean to, he's just wired this way. And little by little, he learns that you'll carry the emotional labor for both of you, that he can retreat into his cave, and when he's ready, you'll still be standing there. But here's the brutal truth. Empathy without boundaries doesn't heal an avoidant. It rewards them. It allows them to keep playing out their fear of intimacy without consequence. And as long as there's no consequence, why would they ever choose change? I want you to picture this. Every time you welcome him back after silence, every time you soothe instead of holding accountable, every time you rationalize instead of naming the truth, you're teaching him, not teaching him that he is safe to love you, not teaching him that vulnerability creates intimacy, but teaching him that his withdrawal is tolerated, even accepted. And so he grows more confident in his avoidance, not less, more certain that he can come and go as he pleases while your empathy fills the gaps. That's not love. That's training someone to abandon you without fear of losing you. And this is where you have to ask yourself a difficult question. Is my empathy serving connection, or is it serving his avoidance? Because real empathy, healthy empathy, doesn't erase accountability. It doesn't excuse harm. It sees the wound, yes, but it also names the behavior. It holds truth alongside compassion. When empathy becomes unconditional tolerance, you lose your power. But when empathy is paired with boundaries, everything shifts. Because then, instead of teaching him that withdrawal is safe, you teach yourself that your love deserves presence. And that shift isn't about punishing him, it's about protecting you. What no one tells you is that when empathy becomes one-sided, it tilts the entire relationship into imbalance. It puts you in the position of giver, caretaker, and emotional translator, while the avoidant settles into the role of receiver, taker, and distant authority. And once that imbalance is set, intimacy isn't possible, because intimacy requires equality. Think about the dance you've been in. You're constantly reaching across the gap, trying to understand him. You imagine his childhood, you consider his fears, you adjust your tone, your timing, your words. You carry both your emotions and his, constantly cushioning the edges so he doesn't feel threatened. And what does he carry of yours? Very little, maybe surface level attention, maybe crumbs of affection when he feels safe enough. But your depth, your longing, your needs, those rarely get met with the same devotion you pour into his. And so, without realizing it, you become the emotional parent in the relationship. You soothe, you explain, you forgive, you wait. He withholds, he withdraws, he dictates the pace. And in that split, the power shifts. You stop being two adults building something together. You become the nurturer, and he becomes the guarded child who gets to decide when he'll allow closeness. This is why you feel exhausted, even while you're trying to be compassionate. Because empathy without reciprocity isn't intimacy. It's servitude. It's carrying the weight of two hearts while only one person is doing the lifting. And the longer you play that role, the smaller you become in your own life. I want you to notice something in this imbalance. Your needs start to feel like burdens. You hesitate to ask for reassurance because you don't want to push him. You silence your longings because you know they'll scare him. You accept less and less because you've been conditioned to believe that asking for more will drive him away. That is not love. It's self-abandonment disguised as empathy. And the avoidant, they learn that they don't have to meet you halfway. They learn that the relationship will always bend around their comfort while you stretch yourself thinner and thinner. That imbalance of power isn't just unfair, it's unsustainable. But here's the liberation. Once you see that empathy has been keeping you in the role of emotional caretaker, you can reclaim your position as an equal. You can stop softening every truth to protect him. You can stop excusing every withdrawal. You can say, my needs matter just as much as yours. My heart deserves to be held, not just to hold. And when you step back into that balance, everything changes. Because intimacy isn't created by one person endlessly empathizing. It's created when two people show up with equal courage, equal vulnerability, equal investment. Without that, it's not a partnership, it's a performance where only one person is showing up for the script. Send this to someone who's been stuck in this dynamic for far too long. One of the most devastating effects of misplaced empathy is that it blurs your vision. It becomes the very fog that keeps you from seeing the relationship for what it actually is. Because every time you empathize with his distance, every time you excuse his silence, every time you translate his coldness into he's just scared, you're rewriting reality in a way that protects him but betrays you. Empathy becomes a filter. Instead of naming the pattern, he pulls away, he avoids closeness, he dismisses your needs. You interpret it as something noble, something tragic, something that deserves endless patience. You see the child who wasn't loved enough, the man who was never taught how to stay, the human being beneath the armor. And while that may all be true, it doesn't change the fact that in the present, you are not being met. Have you ever caught yourself defending him to your friends? Saying things like, he's not a bad guy, he's just afraid, or he does care, he just doesn't know how to show it. That's empathy working as a mask. It paints over the sharp edges of reality, softening the picture so you can keep holding on. But here's the danger. When you keep rationalizing his avoidance, you stop recognizing your own deprivation. Empathy, unchecked, turns into a story that keeps you trapped. You convince yourself you're being strong, understanding, even spiritual for seeing beyond his behavior. But what if that understanding is actually the very thing preventing you from leaving a dynamic that starves you? What if your compassion is the cage? Because, let's be honest, when you strip away the story, what remains? Nights of silence, texts unanswered, affection rationed, intimacy withheld, your nervous system running on high alert, waiting for scraps of connection. That's the reality. But empathy covers it up, whispers, he means well, just wait a little longer. And here's the painful paradox. The more you empathize with his wounds, the less you acknowledge your own. The more you see the child in him, the less you see the woman in you who is aching, waiting, starving for love that doesn't arrive. Empathy becomes the blindfold that keeps you walking deeper into a relationship that isn't really there. But once you lift that blindfold, everything sharpens. You stop mistaking absence for mystery. You stop romanticizing silence as depth. You stop excusing distance as trauma. You see it for what it is, avoidance. Not potential, not love, hidden beneath layers, just avoidance. And when you see it clearly, you reclaim your power. Because then empathy stops being the mask that protects his fear and becomes the mirror that reflects your truth. And that truth is simple. No amount of compassion is worth losing yourself in someone else's refusal to show up. Here's the truth that cuts the deepest. When all of your empathy is tied up in someone who cannot receive it, you don't just lose them, you lose the chance to be loved in the way you were born to be loved. Because as long as you keep pouring into a closed container, your heart can't be open to someone who could actually hold it. Think about how much energy you've invested in understanding him, how many nights you've lain awake, replaying conversations, analyzing silences, trying to decode his distance. Think about how many times you've explained his behavior to yourself, softened the blow, told yourself stories that kept hope alive. That energy is sacred, that focus, that devotion. It is the most powerful thing you have. And yet, in this dynamic, it's being spent on survival instead of creation. Empathy becomes the leash that ties you to scarcity. It convinces you to stay in relationships where you are underfed, underseen, underloved. It whispers that if you just hold on a little longer, if you just understand a little more, he'll finally meet you where you are. And in the meantime, life is passing. Opportunities for real love, for mutual devotion, for relationships that actually expand you, they slip by unnoticed because your gaze is locked on the one man who cannot open. Here's the harshest irony. The very quality that makes you extraordinary, your capacity to love through pain, to empathize through walls, is the same quality that keeps you bound to people who can't love you back. Your empathy becomes the very chain that holds you in a prison of almost love. But what happens if you redirect that empathy? What if, instead of using it to excuse someone else's avoidance, you turn it inward? What if you gave yourself the same depth of understanding you've been giving him? What if your empathy said, "Of course I want closeness. Of course I ache for connection. Of course I deserve to be met. There is nothing wrong with me for wanting more." Because when you turn your empathy back on yourself, something powerful breaks open. You stop waiting for breadcrumbs. You stop chasing after someone else's half-heart. You realize that your longing is not a weakness. It's your guide. It's pointing you toward the kind of love that exists outside of this cycle. The kind of love where empathy is mutual, where compassion is exchanged, where your depth is met with equal depth. And that is the love you were built for. So the question isn't just, why doesn't set empathy work with avoidance? The real question is, how much longer will I let misplaced empathy keep me from the love that would actually set me free? So here we are. You've seen how empathy, this beautiful, life-giving force inside of you, gets twisted in the hands of an avoidant. It doesn't melt their walls, it reinforces them. It doesn't pull them closer, it gives them permission to retreat. It doesn't balance the relationship, it tilts it so that you're carrying the weight of both hearts. And in the end, it doesn't just fail to connect you, it blinds you, masks the truth, and keeps you from the love you're actually meant to have. But here's the shift I want you to take with you. There is nothing wrong with your empathy, nothing wrong with your love, nothing wrong with the depth you carry. The only thing that was off was the direction. You kept pouring it into someone who could not or would not hold it. And that's why it never worked. Not because you were too much, but because he was unwilling. The reckoning is this. Empathy without boundaries is self-abandonment. Empathy without reciprocity is servitude. And empathy given to someone who refuses intimacy is not compassion, it's captivity. When you finally see that, the power returns to your hands. Because then you realize you don't need to stop being empathetic. You just need to stop wasting it where it can't grow. So imagine this, your empathy, your love, your capacity to understand offered to someone who wants it. Someone who doesn't shrink from it, but expands in it. Someone who doesn't interpret it as pressure, but as freedom. Someone who doesn't vanish when you draw closer, but holds your gaze and stays. That is not a fantasy. That is what happens when you stop confusing empathy with endurance and start aligning it with worth. And maybe the question isn't, why doesn't set empathy work with avoidance? Maybe the question you leave with tonight is, what could my empathy create if I gave it to myself first and then to someone who actually wanted to meet me there? That's the door you get to walk through now. That's the standard you get to set. And as you do, you'll find that the very thing that broke you in the wrong hands becomes the very thing that heals you in the right ones. If this spoke to your soul, subscribe, not as a transaction, but as a way of walking this path together. Because your love is not a problem to solve, it's a power to protect. And when you protect it, you set yourself free.